The Olympic Peninsula in Washington state did not just welcome you, it swallowed you whole. The towering Douglas firs and ancient Sitka spruces formed a colossal, impenetrable canopy that choked out the sunlight, leaving the forest floor in a state of perpetual, moss-draped twilight. For Yasser, this absolute isolation was the entire point. Yasser was a veteran wildlife photographer, a man who had traded the chaotic, suffocating concrete grids of the city for the unforgiving but honest embrace of the wilderness. He had spent his adult life tracking the untamed, grizzlies in Alaska, elusive jaguars in the Amazon, and now the phantom-like mountain lions of the Pacific Northwest. He was a man comfortable in his own solitude, provided he had a camera in his hand and his closest companion by his side. That companion was Duke, a 100-pound purebred Belgian Malinois. Duke was not a pet, he was a highly trained tactical partner. With a coat the color of burnt mahogany and eyes that held an ancient, wolf-like intelligence, Duke was fearless. He had stood his ground against charging boars and had once placed himself between Yasser and a territorial black bear without issuing a single sound of hesitation. Duke was Yasser's early warning system, his protector, and his only tether to the civilized world when they were 50 miles deep into the backcountry. The air was sharp and bit at Yasser's cheeks as he finished securing the last of his equipment. It was late October, and the damp chill of the Pacific Northwest was beginning to settle into the marrow of his bones. His campsite was Spartan but efficient, a heavy-duty, all-weather solitary tent pitched on a rare patch of flat, dry earth, a small fire ring constructed from river stones, and his heavy waterproof duffel bag suspended from a high branch to keep them out of reach of opportunistic scavengers. But the real work lay in the perimeter. Yasser spent the dying hours of the afternoon meticulously setting up his trap line. These were not snares of wire and steel, but traps of light and data. He mounted 5 high-end, weather-sealed motion sensor trail cameras to the trunks of the surrounding trees. These were not cheap commercial-grade devices. They were professional rigs, equipped with silent infrared flashes and sub-second trigger speeds. They were positioned in a wide circle around the campsite, their lenses pointing outward into the dense underbrush, covering every conceivable game trail that led toward his clearing. "All right, Duke," Yasser muttered, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He adjusted the camouflage housing on the final camera, double-checking the tightness of the strap against the rough bark. "If that ghost of a cougar comes anywhere near us tonight, we'll have him dead to rights in ultra-high definition." Duke sat at attention, his ears swiveled forward like radar dishes, scanning the darkening tree line. He let out a soft huff of acknowledgement, his muscular chest expanding. As the sun finally dipped below the jagged horizon of the mountains, the forest underwent its nightly transformation. The familiar greens and browns bled away, replaced by infinite shades of black and charcoal. The daytime sounds of chattering squirrels and distant crows were replaced by the profound, heavy silence of the nocturnal wilderness, a silence that was only occasionally broken by the snap of a twig or the distant, mournful hoot of an owl. Yasser retreated to his tent, zipping the heavy canvas door shut against the creeping cold. He ignited a small, battery-powered lantern that cast a warm amber glow across the interior. He unrolled his thermal sleeping bag, organized his primary DSLR camera and a heavy-duty hunting knife within arm's reach, and settled in. Duke curled up at the foot of the sleeping bag, a warm, solid anchor in the darkness. For the first few hours, the night proceeded exactly as thousands of nights before it had. Yasser reviewed some of his daytime shots on his laptop, the soft clicking of the keys the only sound in the tent. Eventually, exhaustion overtook him. He powered down the lantern, plunging the tent into absolute, suffocating darkness, and let the rhythmic sound of Duke's breathing lull him into a deep sleep. It started at exactly 3:14 a.m. Yasser was jolted awake, not by a loud noise, but by a subtle, terrifying shift in the atmosphere. The temperature in the tent seemed to have plummeted, but what woke him completely was the vibration. It was coming from Duke. Yasser reached out in the pitch black, his hand finding the thick fur of the Malinois's neck. Duke's body was rigid, locked in a state of muscular tension so extreme it felt like touching a stone statue. The dog was trembling violently, emitting a sound Yasser had never heard in all their years together. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't even a traditional growl. It was a low, guttural, almost subsonic frequency that rattled deep within the dog's chest, a sound born not of aggression, but of pure, paralyzing terror. "Duke," Yasser whispered, his voice barely carrying over the sound of his own racing heartbeat. "What is it, boy?" Normally, if a bear or a coyote encroached on their camp, Duke would be on his feet instantly, throwing his massive weight against the tent door, barking furiously to establish dominance and drive the threat away. But now, Duke refused to move. He remained plastered to the floor of the tent, his body pressed tightly against Yasser's legs, as if trying to merge with the earth itself. Yasser blindly grabbed the heavy hunting knife from his gear pile, his knuckles turning white around the rubberized grip. He strained his ears, holding his breath to listen over the frantic pounding of blood in his ears. The forest was dead silent. It was an unnatural, absolute silence. The wind had died completely. There was no rustling of leaves, no snapping of twigs, no nocturnal insects. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Then, through the thin fabric of the tent, Yasser saw it. A faint, localized burst of infrared light, barely perceptible to the human eye, but unmistakable to a professional photographer. It was the faint red glow of one of his trail cameras triggering. Click. The sound of the shutter was practically non-existent, but in the crushing silence of the woods, Yasser's trained ears picked it up. Someone or something had just crossed the perimeter. Yasser tensed, expecting the heavy footfalls of a bear investigating the camp or the stealthy padded steps of a mountain lion. He waited for the rustle of canvas, the snort of an animal picking up their scent. Nothing happened. Seconds ticked by, stretching into agonized minutes. Duke's terrifying low-frequency hum continued, the dog's eyes locked onto a specific corner of the tent wall. Then another faint red glow. This one came from a different angle. The camera on the eastern tree had triggered. Click. Whatever was out there was moving. It was circling the camp. But it was doing so with a silence that defied the laws of physics. Not a single dry leaf crunched, not a single twig snapped under its weight. A 100-pound cougar makes noise when it walks through dry brush. A massive grizzly sounds like a freight train, but this entity moved like a shadow detached from its host. The night stretched into a psychological torture chamber. For 3 hours, Yasser sat frozen in the darkness, his hand cramped around the hilt of his knife, his other hand resting on Duke's quivering back. Every 20 or 30 minutes, another infrared flash would faintly illuminate the nylon wall of the tent. Click. It was methodical, patient, unrushed. It wasn't acting like an animal looking for food. It was acting like something observing, watching, waiting. By the time the first gray, watery light of dawn began to bleed through the fabric of the tent, the flashes had finally stopped. Duke's trembling slowly subsided, though the dog remained unnervingly quiet, his tail tucked firmly between his hind legs. Yasser let out a breath he felt he had been holding for hours. His muscles screamed in protest as he finally uncoiled his legs. He unzipped the tent door with agonizing slowness, the loud rasp of the zipper shattering the morning quiet. He stepped out into the frigid dawn air, knife drawn, sweeping his gaze across the clearing. The camp was immaculate. The fire ring was undisturbed, the duffel bags hung exactly where he had left them. There were no massive paw prints in the soft, damp earth, no scratch marks on the tree trunks, no scent of musk or wet fur lingering in the morning mist. It was as if the terrifying night had been nothing more than a shared hallucination between a man and his dog. Yasser exhaled heavily, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. "Just our imaginations running wild, right, Duke?" he called out. Duke finally emerged from the tent, but he didn't bound out with his usual morning energy. He stepped out cautiously, his nose to the ground, sniffing frantically. He walked in a tight circle around the tent, the hair on the back of his neck standing straight up. Yasser shook his head, sheathing his knife. He needed to know what had triggered the sensors. He needed the logical, undeniable proof of a mountain lion or an insomniac deer to settle his frayed nerves. He walked over to the nearest tree, the one facing the entrance of his tent. He popped the latches on the waterproof housing of the trail camera and extracted the SD card. He walked back to his gear, booted up his ruggedized laptop, and slotted the memory card in. His hands were still slightly numb from the cold as he clicked on the folder holding the night's captures. There were 42 new files. Yasser clicked on the first image, taken at 3:14 a.m. He expected to see the glowing, reflective eyes of a predator staring back at the lens. Instead, the frame was filled entirely by the canvas exterior of his own tent, illuminated by the ghostly, desaturated green of the infrared night vision. Frowning, Yasser clicked to the next image, 3:18 a.m. The angle was slightly different. The camera had been physically moved. It was no longer attached to the tree trunk. The shot was taken from a lower angle, looking slightly upward at the tent. A cold dread began to pool in Yasser's stomach. Trail cameras don't move themselves. He clicked the right arrow key, rapidly cycling through the images. 3:40 a.m., 4:12 a.m., 4:55 a.m. With every click, the camera angle changed. It was moving closer, much closer. The perspective was undeniably human, standing at eye level, then crouching, then standing again. Someone had carefully unstrapped his camera from the tree in the dead of night without making a single sound and had spent the entire night using it. Yasser's breath caught in his throat as he reached the final 5 images. The photographer was no longer taking pictures of the outside of the tent. The zipper of the tent door had been quietly, painstakingly pulled down just a few inches, an opening so small Yasser hadn't noticed it in the dark. The camera lens had been slipped through the gap. The last 5 photos were crystal clear, high-resolution infrared shots of the interior of the tent. They were pictures of Yasser. He was asleep in his sleeping bag, completely oblivious. Duke was curled at his feet, his eyes wide open, staring directly into the camera lens with a look of helpless, paralyzed terror. The photos zoomed in progressively. The final image was an extreme close-up of Yasser's face, peaceful and unaware in his sleep. The camera lens had to have been no more than 6 inches away from his nose. Yasser's blood turned to ice water. He stared at the screen, his vision blurring. He slowly reached for his pocket to check his primary DSLR camera, the one he always kept loaded with a high-capacity memory card for daytime shoots. He pulled it out. The memory card slot was open. The stalker hadn't just used Yasser's trail camera to document the terrifying intrusion. Before slipping back into the shadows of the woods, the silent watcher had taken the main memory card from Yasser's personal camera as a souvenir. Duke let out a soft, whimpering cry, pressing himself tightly against Yasser's leg. They were 50 miles from the nearest paved road, entirely alone in the endless ocean of the Olympic wilderness, and whoever had stood over Yasser with a camera in the dead of night was still out there. The empty memory card slot of the DSLR gaped at Yasser like a missing tooth. a dark, silent mockery of his supposed expertise. He stood frozen in the center of his campsite, the damp morning chill entirely forgotten, replaced by a cold, prickling sweat that broke across his shoulders and the back of his neck. He was a man who understood predators. He knew the warning signs of a stalking cougar, the sudden silencing of songbirds, the faint rustle of underbrush, the heavy, musky scent carried on a downdraft. He knew the blunt, noisy aggression of a bear. But this was a violation that defied the laws of the wild. Whoever, or whatever, had stood inches from his face in the dead of night possessed a level of stealth that bordered on the supernatural. They hadn't wanted his expensive lenses. They hadn't wanted his emergency satellite beacon or his freeze-dried rations. They wanted him to know they had been there. They wanted the psychological dominance of taking his memories, his security, and leaving him with nothing but sheer, unadulterated terror. "Come here, Duke," Yasser whispered, his voice cracking. The Belgian Malinois, usually a coiled spring of muscle and boundless energy, crept toward him with his belly practically scraping the wet earth. Duke pressed his heady head against Yasser's knee, letting out another one of those low, vibrating whines. The dog's amber eyes darted frantically toward the impenetrable wall of sword ferns and moss-draped spruce trees that encircled the clearing. "We're leaving," Yasser said, the decision solidifying in his mind with crystalline clarity. "Right now." Normally, breaking down a backcountry camp was a methodical, almost meditative process for Yasser. Tents were folded along specific creases to prevent wear. Gear was packed by weight distribution, and the site was swept to leave zero trace of human presence. Today, it was an exercise in chaotic panic. Yasser moved with frantic, jerky motions. He didn't bother folding the heavy weather tent. He simply collapsed the fiberglass poles and shoved the sprawling mass of wet canvas into his primary waterproof duffel, using his knee to forcefully compress it. He grabbed his sleeping bag, his cooking gear, and his remaining cameras, tossing them haphazardly into his pack. Every few seconds he would stop, his hand dropping instinctively to the rubberized hilt of the hunting knife strapped to his thigh. He would scan the tree line, his eyes straining to penetrate the deep emerald shadows. The forest, which had felt like a sanctuary just 24 hours ago, now felt like a sprawling, intricately designed trap. The massive trunks of the ancient trees looked like the bars of a cage. The hanging curtains of club moss looked like grasping hands. "He's watching you right now," a dark, intrusive voice whispered in the back of Yasser's mind. "He watched you sleep. He's watching you run." It took him less than 15 minutes to pack what usually took an hour. He hoisted the heavy, unbalanced pack onto his shoulders, wincing as the poorly packed gear dug into his spine. He clipped Duke's heavy, tactical lead to his harness, something he rarely did in the deep backcountry. But today, he needed to feel the physical connection to the dog. He needed to know Duke wouldn't bolt into the woods, or worse, be lured away. "Let's go. Track back. To the Jeep," Yasser commanded. They set off down the faint, winding game trail that served as their only navigational tether to the outside world. The trailhead, where Yasser had parked his modified Jeep Wrangler, was roughly 14 miles away. In good conditions, with a properly packed bag and an unburdened mind, it was a grueling 7-hour hike through the dense, unforgiving topography of the Olympic Peninsula. Today, it felt like a death march. The silence of the forest was absolute and oppressive. The canopy overhead was so thick that the morning sun barely penetrated, casting the trail in a permanent, sickly green twilight. Yasser pushed the pace, practically jogging where the terrain allowed, his boots slipping and sliding on the exposed, slick roots of the spruce trees. Duke led the way, but his body language was entirely wrong. A tracking dog's nose should be to the ground, its tail up, its ears swiveling to catch the sounds of the forest. Duke's head was on a swivel, his ears pinned flat against his skull, and his tail remained firmly tucked. He was constantly checking his 6 o'clock, looking back at Yasser, and then staring deep into the impenetrable brush flanking the trail. 2 hours bled into 3. Yasser's lungs burned, and his legs screamed in protest against the punishing, uneven pace. He was dehydrated, having skipped his morning water purification routine in his haste to flee, but he refused to stop. To stop was to become a stationary target. As they crested a steep, muddy ridge roughly halfway to the trailhead, Yasser felt a sudden, sharp tug on the leash. Duke had slammed on the brakes. The dog planted his forepaws firmly in the muck, his hackles rising in a stiff ridge down his spine. He let out a low, warning growl, not the terrified vibration from the night before, but a sound of imminent defensive aggression. "What is it?" Yasser hissed, dropping to one knee and drawing his knife. His eyes scanned the trail ahead. There was nothing but ferns, mud, and rotting logs. "Forward, Duke, come on," Yasser urged, tugging gently on the lead. Duke refused. He whined, taking a half step backward, bumping into Yasser's legs. The dog was staring intently at a massive fallen cedar tree that lay horizontally across the trail about 30 yards ahead. They would have to climb over it to continue. Yasser tightened his grip on the knife. He unclipped a canister of bear mace from his chest rig with his left hand, his thumb resting on the safety trigger. "Stay close," he muttered to the dog. He approached the fallen cedar with agonizing slowness, placing his boots carefully to avoid snapping any stray twigs. The silence of the woods was deafening, broken only by the ragged sound of his own breathing. When he reached the massive trunk, he paused, listening for any movement on the other side. Nothing. He hoisted himself up, throwing one leg over the damp, mossy bark, and looked down at the trail on the opposite side. His heart stopped, perfectly still in his chest. Placed perfectly in the center of the muddy trail, resting on a pristine, dry green fern leaf, was a small, rectangular object. Yasser slid down the other side of the log, his legs trembling so violently he nearly collapsed. He knelt beside the object. It was a Polaroid photograph. The chemical smell of the instant film was still faintly sweet in the damp air. It had been printed recently, very recently. With a shaking hand, Yasser picked it up. The image was a shot of the very trail he was currently standing on. But what made the breath leave Yasser's lungs in a strangled gasp was the subject of the photo. It was a picture of Yasser's own back. He was captured mid-stride, hauling his badly packed duffel bag, with Duke walking just ahead of him. The angle of the shot indicated the photographer had been slightly elevated, perhaps on a small ridge or a low branch, directly behind them. Yasser flipped the photo over. The white backing was blank, save for a single small detail. Pressed into the bottom right corner was a tiny, perfect fingerprint in what looked like dark reddish-brown mud, or perhaps dried blood. He wasn't just being followed, he was being herded. The Stalker had a portable instant printer, connected via Bluetooth or Wi-Fi to whatever device he had used to take the picture. He had taken this photo of Yasser hiking, printed it in the woods, rushed ahead of him with impossible silent speed, and placed it on the trail for Yasser to find. It was a demonstration of absolute physical superiority. The Stalker was telling Yasser, "I am faster than you, I am quieter than you, I control this environment." "Hey!" Yasser screamed, his voice tearing out of his throat, raw and desperate. He spun around in a frantic circle, wielding the hunting knife like a madman. "Show yourself! What do you want from me?" The forest absorbed his screams without an echo. The towering trees stood like indifferent monolithic sentinels. Duke barked once, a sharp, nervous sound, and pressed against Yasser's shins. "We have to move," Yasser choked out, shoving the Polaroid into his chest pocket. The psychological weight of the photo felt heavier than his entire pack. Panic completely overrode his exhaustion. He began to run. It was a clumsy, dangerous sprint over treacherous ground. Roots caught the toes of his boots. Low-hanging branches whipped violently against his face, leaving stinging red welts, but Yasser didn't care. He practically dragged Duke alongside him, his breathing turning into ragged, painful gasps. He just needed to reach the Ho River crossing. The river crossing was the final major obstacle before the trail smoothed out into a manageable 2-mile hike to the parking lot. It was a deep, fast-moving channel of freezing glacial runoff, completely unfordable by foot. The only way across was a narrow, terrifying suspension bridge, a precarious construct of thick steel cables and wooden planks maintained by the Parks Department, suspended 50 feet above the roaring rapids. If he could just get across the bridge, he would be in the home stretch. He could cut the ropes on the other side if he had to. He could create a barrier. The sound of the rushing water reached his ears long before he saw the river. It was a roar of white noise that finally drowned out the terrifying, oppressive silence of the woods. "Almost there, Duke! Almost there!" Yasser yelled over the roar of the rapids, adrenaline flooding his system for a final push. They burst through the final dense thicket of ferns, emerging onto the locky, elevated embankment overlooking the Ho River. The water below was a violent churn of white foam and jagged black rocks. Yasser sprinted toward the two massive wooden pylons that anchored the suspension bridge on his side of the river. He skidded to a halt, the loose gravel tearing at his boots. The momentum sent Duke sliding past him, the dog yelping as the leash snapped taut. Yasser dropped to his knees on the edge of the precipice, a cry of absolute despair tearing from his lips. The bridge was gone. The thick braided steel cables hadn't frayed or snapped from age. They had been intentionally, cleanly severed. The heavy industrial-grade metal ropes hung limply down the side of the cliff, swaying gently in the mist rising from the rapids. The entire wooden walkway of the bridge had collapsed and swung down to crash against the cliff face on the opposite side of the river, completely out of reach. Severing those cables would require heavy-duty bolt cutters or a portable angle grinder. It would require time. It required planning. The Stalker hadn't just been following him. He had anticipated his exact route of escape. Yasser slowly turned around, his back to the impassable gorge. The sun had finally dipped behind the towering peaks of the Olympic Mountains, plunging the forest back into the deep, suffocating shadows of twilight. He was trapped on this side of the river. Night was falling, and the silent photographer was somewhere in the trees, waiting for the dark. The severed steel cables of the suspension bridge swayed with a rhythmic, sickening creak against the rocky gorge wall. It was the only sound that penetrated the roar of the Ho River rushing violently 50 feet below. Yasser stared at the frayed, shining ends of the heavy wire rope. They were clean cuts. A hydraulic cutter. Someone had hiked up here with 30 pounds of specialized industrial equipment for the sole purpose of slamming the door shut on his only way out. Panic, raw and acidic, bubbled in the back of Yasser's throat. He was an expert in survival, but survival training dictated reacting to natural elements, weather, terrain, apex predators. There was no manual for surviving an invisible, omnipotent phantom who treated the Olympic wilderness like a private, locked chessboard. "Okay," Yasser breathed out, forcing the word through numb lips. He gripped Duke's leash so tightly his knuckles ached. "Okay, we can't cross. We can't stay in the open." The sun was a sliver of bloody crimson sinking behind the jagged canopy of the spruces. In less than 30 minutes, the forest would be plunged into a darkness so absolute it would feel suffocating. Yasser turned his back to the gorge, his eyes frantically scanning the dense wall of the tree line. He needed a choke point. He needed a position where his back was covered, where this ghost couldn't simply slip behind him in the silence. About 100 yards upstream, bordering the edge of the rocky embankment, an ancient monolithic cedar had fallen decades ago. Its massive root system had been torn from the earth, creating an imposing concave wall of hardened mud, tangled roots, and jagged stone standing nearly 10 feet tall. Beneath the overhang of this colossal root ball was a shallow, natural depression in the ground. It wasn't a cave, but it was a bunker. It offered solid protection from the rear and a limited frontal field of view. "Move, Duke," Yasser ordered, his voice dropping to a harsh, tactical whisper. They scrambled over the loose shale and slick river stones, throwing themselves into the shadowy hollow beneath the roots. The space was cramped, smelling of damp earth, decay, and centuries-old moss. Yasser immediately dropped his heavy, useless duffel bag, using it as a makeshift sandbag at the front of their small alcove. He didn't bother unpacking the tent. Setting it up would only restrict his vision and trap him inside a nylon coffin. Instead, he drew his hunting knife and unholstered the canister of bear mace. He placed them meticulously on top of the duffel bag, right next to his high-lumen tactical flashlight. He looked at his watch, 6:45 p.m. The temperature was already plummeting, the damp cold seeping through his moisture-wicking layers. But he knew he couldn't build a fire. A fire would provide warmth, but it would also destroy his natural night vision and illuminate him perfectly against the dark backdrop of the roots. He would become a glowing target in a shooting gallery. He had to embrace the dark. Duke crawled to the very back of the hollow, pressing his large body into the furthest, tightest corner. The dog's eyes were wide, reflecting the dying ambient light like twin amber coins. He was shivering violently again, that same low, terrifying subsonic hum vibrating in his throat. "I know, buddy. I know," Yasser whispered, sliding back to sit beside the dog, placing a heavy, reassuring hand on Duke's ribs. "If he comes into the light, we fight. That's the only rule tonight. We fight." The final rays of the sun vanished. The transition was terrifyingly swift. The forest swallowed the twilight, replacing the greens and browns with a void of impenetrable black. The roar of the river behind them served as a chaotic, deafening curtain of white noise, masking any subtle sounds from the woods. Yasser strained his eyes, peering over the top of his duffel bag into the abyss of the tree line. An hour passed. Then two. The cold became a physical agony, stiffening Yasser's joints. Every shadow seemed to writhe and contort. A low-hanging branch became a crouching man. A sway of ferns became a silent stalker creeping closer. Yasser's thumb hovered over the power button of his tactical flashlight, desperate to click it on and banish the shadows, but he forced himself to wait. Discipline was his only weapon right now. It began at exactly 9:15 p.m. It wasn't a footstep. It wasn't a snapped twig. It was a sound Yasser knew intimately, a sound that made the blood freeze in his veins. Whir, beep. It was the electronic, motorized sound of a professional camera lens autofocusing in the dark. It came from the tree line, directly in front of their bunker, no more than 50 feet away. Yasser's breath hitched. He grabbed his flashlight with his left hand and his knife with his right, but before he could raise the beam, the world exploded in a blinding flash of pure Arctic white light. Fzzz, pop. The strobe was unimaginably powerful, a high-end external flash unit designed to illuminate vast dark spaces. It struck Yasser directly in the face with the intensity of a lightning bolt. For 3 agonizing seconds, Yasser was completely, utterly blind. A massive, burning purple afterimage seared itself across his retinas, obscuring everything. He threw his arm over his eyes, a cry of shock escaping his lips. "Hey!" Yasser roared, pointing his flashlight blindly into the darkness and clicking it on. The beam sliced through the night, illuminating nothing but mossy trunks and empty ferns. Duke barked wildly, a frantic, hysterical sound, snapping his jaws at the empty air, completely disoriented by the blinding flash. Then, from a completely different angle, 30 degrees to the right, whir, beep, vzz, pop. Another blinding detonation of light. This time, Yasser caught a microscopic glimpse of something in the fraction of a second the forest was illuminated. A silhouette. Tall, unnaturally thin, wearing what looked like a dark hooded rain slicker, standing completely motionless beside a split-trunk cedar. But by the time Yasser swung his flashlight beam toward the spot, blinking furiously through the burning purple spots in his vision, the figure was gone. There was no rustle of retreat, no sound of running feet, just the roar of the river and the mocking emptiness of the trees. The psychological warfare had escalated. The stalker wasn't just watching anymore. He was hunting. He was using Yasser's own profession, his own tools, to completely disorient and paralyze him. "Show yourself, you coward!" Yasser screamed, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and profound terror. He swept the flashlight beam left and right in frantic arcs. Silence. The heavy, oppressive silence of the deep woods. Yasser killed the flashlight. He needed his night vision to return, no matter how desperately he wanted the comfort of the light. He squeezed his eyes shut, rubbing them aggressively to clear the afterimages. Whirpy! This time, the sound came from the left. Much closer. Maybe 30 feet. Yasser didn't wait for the flash. He raised the canister of bear mace over the barricade and depressed the trigger, sending a massive orange cloud of highly pressurized capsaicin screaming into the dark woods. The chemical spray hissed violently, coating the ferns and the lower trunks of the trees in a thick, choking fog. He waited for a cough, a scream of pain, the sound of someone thrashing in the brush. Nothing. The orange mist simply drifted lazily on the damp night air, settling harmlessly onto the wet earth. He had fired at a phantom. 10 minutes of agonizing, unbroken darkness followed. Yasser's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Duke had stopped barking, returning to his terrified, vibrating state, pressing his nose under Yasser's thigh. Then, Yasser heard a new sound. It was a soft, rhythmic thump, 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 coming from directly in front of the root ball bunker. It sounded like something light and plastic bouncing gently over the uneven rocks. Yasser clicked on his flashlight, the beam instantly pinning the object to the ground just 5 feet away from his duffel bag. It was a small, cylindrical plastic film canister, the old-school kind, black with a gray pop-top lid. It had been rolled out of the darkness, stopping perfectly at the edge of his defensible perimeter. Yasser stared at it. It could be an explosive. It could be a trick. But the morbid, horrifying curiosity was too powerful. Keeping his knife raised and his eyes darting toward the tree line, he cautiously extended his left hand, leaning over the duffel bag, and snatched the canister from the ground. He retreated instantly back into the hollow of the roots. His hands shook uncontrollably as he popped the gray plastic lid off. Inside, there was no roll of film. Instead, there was a small, tightly rolled piece of glossy paper and a tiny black plastic square. Yasser shook the contents into his palm. The tiny plastic square was his missing SD memory card, the one taken from his camera the night before, while he slept. He slowly unrolled the glossy paper. It was another Polaroid. He brought the flashlight beam down to illuminate the image. The blood drained entirely from Yasser's face, leaving him cold and hollow. The photograph was not of him hiking. It was not of his back. It was a photograph of the exact bunker he was sitting in right now. It showed the massive tangled root system, the hollowed-out earth, and Yasser's waterproof duffel bag acting as a barricade. But the photograph had been taken from above. Yasser slowly, terrifyingly, raised his eyes from the photograph. He looked up, past his flashlight beam, past the edge of the hollowed-out dirt, straight up into the dense, tangled, overhanging mass of roots that formed the roof of his sanctuary. Hanging upside down in the absolute darkness, suspended silently within the twisted, muddy roots less than 4 feet above Yasser's head, a camera lens softly whirred into focus. Whir, beep, fizz, pop. The detonation of light from just 3 feet above Yasser's upturned face was not merely blinding, it was a physical assault. It felt as though a magnesium flare had been ignited directly against his open corneas. The world vanished in an instantaneous, searing wash of absolute white, followed immediately by a crushing, agonizing darkness, heavily layered with burning red and purple afterimages. Yasser let out a guttural roar, a purely primal sound of terror and rage. Completely stripped of his vision, his survival instincts hijacked his body. He lunged upward, driving the heavy, rubberized hilt of his hunting knife blindly into the tangled mass of roots where the flash had originated. His blade didn't hit flesh, but his forearm slammed hard into something solid, something wrapped in slick, wet fabric. A sharp, breathless hiss echoed from the darkness above. The figure had been hanging upside down like a bat, wedged within the intricate lattice of the giant cedar's root system. As Yasser made contact, the stalker shifted with terrifying, unnatural agility. A heavy boot dropped from the darkness, catching Yasser squarely in the chest. The force of the kick sent Yasser tumbling backward out of the hollow depression, his shoulder slamming violently against the loose, jagged river shale. He gasped, the wind knocked completely out of his lungs, his knife flying from his numb fingers to clatter somewhere in the pitch black. "Duke!" "Attack!" Yasser choked out, rolling frantically to his side. The Belgian Malinois, despite his paralyzing fear of the unnatural stalker, responded to the direct command. Duke erupted from the back of the root ball bunker with a furious, deep-chested snarl. The dog launched himself upward into the roots, jaws snapping shut with the force of a steel trap. A tearing sound ripped through the night, the distinct sound of thick, waterproof fabric ripping, followed by the heavy crash of branches and mud as the stalker dropped from the root system. But there was no scream, there was no sound of a struggle. Yasser scrambled to his knees, blinking desperately, tearing at his eyes, but his vision was completely ruined by the strobe effect. "Duke, here, leave it," he yelled, terrified the stalker would gut his dog in the dark. Duke landed on the shale beside him, panting heavily, a torn piece of synthetic black fabric clamped in his teeth. He circled Yasser protectively, barking into the black void of the tree line. Yasser groped the ground frantically, his hands bleeding from the sharp shale until his fingers brushed the cold aluminum cylinder of his tactical flashlight. He clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the front of their ruined bunker. Nothing. The stalker was gone. He had vanished back into the heavy, oppressive silence of the Olympic wilderness as quickly and quietly as he had appeared. "Okay," Yasser rasped, clutching his bruised ribs. He dragged himself back to his waterproof duffel bag, which still sat in the hollow. He shoved the recovered plastic film canister and the stolen SD card within it deep into his jacket pocket. He couldn't stay here. The bunker was compromised. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a coffin. "We're moving, Duke." He didn't bother packing gracefully. He grabbed his heavy bag by the strap and fled into the dark, staying as close to the deafening roar of the Ho River as he dared. The terrain was a nightmare. Slick, moss-covered boulders the size of minivans littered the embankment. One wrong step in the dark meant a broken ankle, or worse, a plunge into the freezing, violent rapids 50 feet below. To compound his misery, the sky finally broke. A freezing, torrential Pacific Northwest downpour began to hammer the forest. The rain fell in sheets, instantly soaking Yasser to the bone and turning the steep embankment into a frictionless mudslide. They crawled, slipped, and fought their way roughly a quarter-mile downstream until Yasser found a narrow vertical fissure between two massive slabs of granite that leaned against each other. It was barely wide enough for a man, but it was deep, shielding them from the driving rain and the open woods. Yasser wedged himself inside, pulling Duke in after him. He was shivering uncontrollably, the early stages of hypothermia beginning to gnaw at his extremities. But the cold in his blood was nothing compared to the psychological ice freezing his mind. Why had the stalker returned the SD card? It wasn't an act of mercy. This entire ordeal was a carefully constructed theater of psychological torture. The stalker wanted Yasser to see what was on that card. With trembling, mud-caked hands, Yasser unzipped the waterproof compartment of his duffel bag and pulled out his ruggedized laptop. He shielded the screen with his body to block the rain and minimize the glow. He slotted the tiny black square into the reader. The folder opened. There were hundreds of files. Yasser clicked on the first image. It wasn't a picture of the wilderness. It was a picture of a crowded city street. Rain slicked the pavement, and neon lights reflected in the puddles. Yasser's heart hammered against his ribs. It was Seattle, his neighborhood. He clicked the right arrow, cycling through the images. The timeline was horrifying. The metadata showed the first photos were taken 6 weeks ago. There were pictures of Yasser walking out of his apartment building, pictures of him having coffee at his local corner shop, pictures of Duke playing in the city dog park. The stalker hadn't stumbled upon Yasser in the woods. He had targeted him. He had chosen him. The photos grew progressively more invasive. There was a shot taken through Yasser's own living room window at night, showing him editing photos at his desk, a shot of his Jeep parked in the garage, a shot of him purchasing the heavy-duty trail cameras at an outdoor supply store in downtown Seattle. Then, the location of the photos shifted to the Olympic Peninsula. There were daylight shots of the suspension bridge, the same bridge that was now destroyed. But these photos were taken days before Yasser had even arrived at the park. Yasser stopped on the final 3 photos. His stomach plummeted into an abyss of absolute despair. The third-to-last photo was a close-up of a pair of heavy-duty hydraulic bolt cutters resting on the wooden planks of the suspension bridge. The second-to-last photo was a wide shot of the bridge, successfully severed, the cables hanging limply against the cliff face. The trap had been set and sprung before Yasser had even parked his Jeep at the trailhead. Yasser clicked to the very last image. It was a topographical map of the Ho River area spread out on a wooden table. A red Sharpie had been used to draw a large, thick circle around the exact sector of the forest where Yasser was currently trapped. Above the circle, written in neat block letters, were 2 words: Darkroom. Yasser slowly closed the laptop, plunging the crevice back into darkness. The sound of the rain lashing against the rocks outside mirrored the chaotic, violent storm inside his head. He wasn't fighting a phantom or an eccentric woodsman. He was fighting a highly organized, obsessive apex predator who had spent months studying his habits, his equipment, and his psychology. The stalker knew Yasser was a photographer. The entire hunt was themed around it: the camera flashes, the Polaroids, the Darkroom. The stalker was waiting for Yasser to break. He was waiting for him to succumb to exhaustion, to run blindly into the woods, or simply to freeze to death on the riverbank. A cold, dead calm suddenly washed over Yasser. The panic, the hyperventilation, the paralyzing terror, it all evaporated, replaced by a singular, hardened resolve. If the stalker wanted to play a game of light and shadow, he had chosen the wrong victim. Yasser was not a helpless hiker. He was a professional who had spent 2 decades mastering light. He knew how to manipulate it, how to bounce it, how to use it to reveal what was hidden. And more importantly, he knew how blinding 600 watt-seconds of unshielded strobe power could be in absolute darkness. Yasser unzipped the deepest compartment of his duffel bag. Inside lay his professional lighting gear, equipment he usually reserved for high-end, staged nature shoots. He pulled out 3 heavy-duty Godox off-camera speedlights and a wireless radio trigger. These weren't the tiny pop-up flashes on consumer cameras. These were industrial-strength strobes, capable of illuminating a football field for a fraction of a second. Fired at close range in a pitch-black forest, they were essentially non-lethal flashbang grenades. "We're not running anymore, Duke," Yasser whispered, his voice steady, stripped of all its previous tremor. He began attaching the wireless receivers to the base of each speedlight. He understood the stalker's methodology now. The stalker relied entirely on stealth, silence, and night vision. Whether he was using military-grade night vision goggles or just highly adapted eyesight, his greatest advantage was the dark. Yasser was going to take that away from him. He crawled to the edge of the granite crevice and peered out into the torrential rain. The forest was an impenetrable wall of black ink. "He's out there. He's tracking us right now," Yasser murmured, adjusting the power output on the first speedlight to its maximum setting, 1/1/2 power. "He expects me to cower. He expects me to hide." Yasser mounted the radio trigger onto the hot shoe of his remaining DSLR camera. He didn't need a lens, he just needed the firing mechanism. He gripped the camera body in his right hand like a detonator. He looked down at Duke. The dog seemed to sense the shift in his master's demeanor. The terrified shivering had stopped. Duke stood at attention, his ears swiveled forward, waiting for a command. "We're going to build a web, buddy," Yasser said grimly. "And when the spider comes, we burn his eyes out." With the heavy strobes tucked under his arms and his finger resting lightly on the camera's shutter button, Yasser stepped out of the protective crevice and walked back into the suffocating darkness of the darkroom. The hunted was dead. The photographer had returned to the shoot. The rain was no longer just weather, it was a physical weight, a relentless, freezing cascade that sought to bury the Olympic Peninsula under an ocean of mud and darkness. Yasser moved through the storm not as a hunted animal, but as a predator adapting to a new ecosystem. The paralyzing terror that had gripped his heart since the previous night had been entirely burned away, replaced by the cold, calculating precision of a professional setting up the most important shoot of his life. He didn't need to see the terrain perfectly. He let his memory of the landscape and the roar of the Ho River guide him. He selected a small, relatively flat clearing roughly 50 yards from the fissure where he had hidden his laptop. It was surrounded by a dense circular grove of towering Sitka spruces, a natural amphitheater of wood and shadow. "Stay close, Duke," Yasser whispered. The dog was glued to his thigh, the rain matting his thick mahogany coat against his muscular frame. Yasser worked rapidly, his fingers numb but steady. He took the first Godox speedlight, a heavy brick of electronics and glass, and wedged it tightly into the V-shaped crook of a spruce branch about 8 feet off the ground, aiming it directly at the center of the clearing. He used a strip of heavy-duty gaffer tape from his emergency kit to secure it. He then scooped up a handful of thick, wet mud and smeared it over the small, blinking red LED indicator light on the side of the unit. In the pitch black, the flash was now completely invisible. He repeated this process with the remaining 2 speedlights, positioning them in a perfect equilateral triangle around the clearing. He created a crossfire of illumination, a triangular kill zone where, once triggered, there would be absolutely no shadows to hide in. He set all 3 units to their absolute maximum power output, 1/1. At close range, firing 600 watt-seconds each, the combined burst would be equivalent to staring directly into the sun through a magnifying glass. To a pair of eyes that had spent hours perfectly adapted to the absolute darkness of the wilderness, it wouldn't just be blinding, it would cause physical agony. Yasser stepped into the center of the trap. He held his stripped-down DSLR camera body in his right hand, his thumb resting lightly on the shutter button connected to the wireless radio trigger. Now he needed bait. He unzipped his jacket, letting the freezing rain soak his thermal layers, and sat down on a rotting log in the very center of the clearing. He pulled Duke tightly against his chest. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his small, low-lumen emergency pen light. He clicked it on, pointing the weak yellow beam at the muddy ground between his boots. In the vast, ink-black ocean of the forest, that tiny circle of yellow light was a beacon. It was a signal of surrender. It communicated exhausting despair and a desperate, pathetic need for comfort. It was exactly what the Stalker was waiting for. Yasser waited. The minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. The cold seeped into his bones, making his teeth chatter uncontrollably. He focused all his remaining mental energy on his thumb, keeping it hovering a fraction of a millimeter above the shutter button. Come on, Yasser thought, his eyes scanning the impenetrable wall of darkness beyond his tiny circle of light. You want the final shot. You want the masterpiece. Come and get it. 45 minutes passed. The only sounds were the deafening roar of the rain hitting the canopy and the rushing river in the distance. Then Duke stiffened. The dog didn't growl. He didn't bark. But his ears pinned flat against his skull, and his body turned as rigid as iron. He was staring directly at the space between two massive spruces at the 12 o'clock position. Yasser didn't move his head. He kept his eyes locked on the muddy ground, playing the part of the broken victim perfectly. Through the rhythmic pounding of the rain, Yasser heard it. It wasn't a footstep. It was the faintest rustle of waterproof synthetic fabric brushing against wet ferns. It was a sound so subtle, it would have been missed by anyone not expecting it. The stalker was entering the clearing. Yasser could feel the presence. It was a heavy, suffocating aura of malevolence closing in on him. The stalker was moving with agonizing slowness, savoring the climax of his psychological masterpiece. He was stepping into the center of the amphitheater, positioning himself for the perfect angle. 10 feet away, Yasser calculated, listening to the microscopic shifts in the mud. 8 feet. Then came the sound Yasser had been waiting for. Whir, beep. The electronic sigh of a professional autofocus lens locking onto its target in the dark. The stalker was raising his camera. He was preparing to fire his own blinding strobe to capture Yasser's face contorted in ultimate, defeated terror before moving in for whatever morbid finale he had planned. Yasser didn't hesitate. He didn't flinch. He simply pressed his thumb down hard on the shutter button. The forest did not just light up, it detonated. 3 massive, unshielded bursts of pure Arctic white light erupted simultaneously from the trees, converging perfectly on the space directly in front of Yasser. The sheer intensity of the 1,800-watt-second explosion vaporized the darkness instantly, freezing the raindrops in midair like millions of tiny diamonds. In the center of that blinding inferno stood a tall, gaunt figure clad head to toe in slick black rain gear. He was wearing an expensive dual-tube night vision binocular rig flipped down over his eyes, holding a heavy DSLR camera rigged with a massive external flash. The effect of the strobes hitting the light-amplifying tubes of the night vision goggles was catastrophic. A horrific, high-pitched scream of absolute agony tore through the forest, a sound of raw, unadulterated human suffering. The figure violently threw his hands over his face, dropping his expensive camera into the mud with a wet crunch. He collapsed to his knees, thrashing wildly, tearing the smoking night vision rig from his head as if it were covered in acid. "Duke, take him," Yasser roared, his voice echoing like thunder. The Belgian Malinois, who had kept his eyes squeezed shut on Yasser's prior command, exploded forward like a coiled spring. 100 pounds of muscle and teeth slammed into the thrashing figure's chest, driving him flat into the mud. Duke's jaws clamped down with bone-crushing force on the man's thick, waterproof shoulder, pinning him to the earth with a terrifying, deep-throated snarl. Yasser dropped his camera trigger and lunged forward, his heavy hunting knife drawn. He slammed his knee into the center of the man's back, pressing the cold steel of the blade firmly against the side of the man's throat. "Don't move," Yasser hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of adrenaline and rage. "Don't you make a single sound." The man beneath him was sobbing hysterically, his hands still clawing blindly at his ruined eyes. "I can't see. My eyes. Oh God, my eyes." Yasser reached into his own pocket and pulled out his heavy tactical flashlight. He clicked it to its brightest setting and shone it directly into the man's face. The stalker squeezed his eyes shut, wailing in pain. He was a man in his late 40s with a sharp, angular face, pale skin and thinning wet hair plastered to his forehead. He didn't look like a rugged mountain man or a savage killer. He looked like an eccentric academic. Yasser grabbed the man by the collar of his expensive jacket, hauling his face out of the mud. "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" The man gasped for air, his face contorted in pain, but as he felt the cold steel against his neck, a twisted, wet smile slowly crept across his face. You ruined the exposure. The man giggled, a hysterical, breathless sound that sent a chill down Yasser's spine. It was supposed to be the apex, the death of the master, captured by the student. Yasser's brow furrowed. He stared at the man's face, the gears in his mind spinning frantically. And then the recognition hit him like a physical blow. Marcus? Yasser breathed, the flashlight trembling in his hand. Marcus Vance? Marcus Vance had been a prodigy in the Seattle fine art photography scene a decade ago. He was brilliant, but obsessed with the macabre. His exhibitions often featured unsettling, highly stylized depictions of suffering and decay. 7 years ago, Vance had practically begged Yasser to let him shadow him on a grizzly bear expedition in Alaska, claiming he wanted to capture the raw, unfiltered essence of mortality. Yasser had flatly refused, citing Vance's unstable behavior and lack of wilderness survival skills. Vance's career had subsequently spiraled into obscurity, rumored to be producing disturbing underground snuff art for wealthy, twisted private collectors on the dark web. "You remembered," Marcus wheezed, blood trickling from where Duke's teeth had punctured his shoulder. I told you the wild wasn't just animals, Yasser. The greatest predator is the lens. I wanted to immortalize you, the great Yasser, reduced to a weeping, cornered rat. The Darkroom exhibition, it was going to be my masterpiece. You're insane, Yasser said, pulling a bundle of heavy-duty zip ties from his tactical vest. He brutally secured Marcus's wrists behind his back, pulling the plastic tight until it bit into the flesh. It doesn't matter, Marcus laughed blindly, spitting rain and blood. The bridge is gone. We're 50 miles from anywhere. We're going to freeze to death out here together, Yasser. The perfect double portrait. The wilderness claims us both. Watch him, Duke, Yasser commanded. He stood up, leaving Marcus writhing in the mud, and walked over to the heavy, waterproof backpack Marcus had dropped. Yasser ripped the bag open, shining his flashlight inside. It was filled with high-end camera bodies, dozens of rolls of instant film, and spare hydraulic cutter blades. But tucked into a protective side pouch, glowing with a faint green LCD light, was the one thing Yasser prayed he would find: a heavy-duty, military-grade satellite phone. Marcus had needed it to upload his art to his dark web buyers in real time. Now, it was Yasser's lifeline. Yasser extended the thick black antenna, pointing it toward a gap in the forest canopy. He waited agonizing seconds for the signal bars to lock onto a satellite. As soon as the connection stabilized, he dialed 911. "Emergency dispatch, what is your location and emergency?" A calm, robotic voice crackled through the static. "My name is Yasser," he said, his voice finally breaking as the weight of the night crashed down on him. "I'm trapped in the Olympic National Park, near the severed Ho River suspension bridge. I have a man secured. He's been hunting me. I need immediate extraction." The extraction was a massive, deafening operation. By 7 a.m., the storm had broken, and the thwack, thwack, thwack of a state police search and rescue helicopter shattered the morning silence. A team of heavily armed tactical rangers rappelled down into the clearing, securing the perimeter with military precision. Marcus Vance was hauled up in a rescue basket, still blind, babbling incoherently about apertures and exposures. Yasser and Duke were airlifted shortly after, wrapped in thermal foil blankets, watching the endless green expanse of the Olympic Peninsula shrink beneath them. The police involvement did not end at the helipad in Port Angeles. The investigation quickly exploded from a simple stalking case into a massive federal operation. 2 days later, Yasser sat in a brightly lit, sterile interrogation room at the FBI field office in Seattle. A weary-looking lead detective, a man named Harris, sat across from him, sliding a thick manila folder across the metal table. "You didn't just survive a madman in the woods, Yasser," Detective Harris said gravely, pouring a cup of terrible precinct coffee. "You dismantled a monster." Harris opened the folder. "We served a warrant on Vance's remote cabin, a few miles off the main highway near the park entrance. We found his darkroom." Yasser stared at the photos inside the folder. They were crime scene shots of a massive, soundproofed basement. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with thousands of Polaroid pictures. "He wasn't just obsessed with you," Harris continued, tapping the photos. "Vance has been using the national parks as his private hunting ground for years. Lone hikers, amateur photographers, people who strayed off the trail. He stalked them, terrorized them, and documented their final days. We're looking at potentially 8 missing persons cases linked to his art sales on the dark web. The bridge he cut? He's done that before to isolate his subjects." A cold numbness washed over Yasser. He had been a hair's breadth away from becoming just another garified face pinned to a basement wall. The tactical gear, the night vision, the satellite uplinks, he had millions of dollars in backing from anonymous buyers who purchased his exhibitions, Harris said, closing the folder. "Your quick thinking with those flashes didn't just save your life. You permanently blinded him. He'll never touch a camera or hurt anyone, ever again." Yasser nodded slowly, the words washing over him but barely registering. He was safe. Duke was safe. The nightmare was over. 2 weeks later, the neon lights of Seattle reflected off the wet pavement outside Yasser's apartment window. He sat at his large oak desk, the soft hum of his computer the only sound in the room. Duke was asleep on his orthopedic bed in the corner, his legs twitching occasionally in a dream. Yasser was finally forcing himself to do it. He had to face the fear. He had his professional film scanner running, slowly digitizing the few rolls of standard 35mm film he had managed to shoot during the first peaceful day of his trip, before the nightmare began. He needed to reclaim his art. He needed to prove to himself that the camera was just a tool, not a weapon. The images slowly rendered on his large, high-definition monitor. Beautiful, serene shots of the ancient spruces. A stunning, wide-angle landscape of the Hoh River before the bridge was cut. A close-up of a rare, vibrant green moss clinging to a rock. It was therapeutic. The beauty of the wild was still there. The scanner hummed, loading the very last frame on the roll. It was a test shot Yasser had taken of his own campsite on that first afternoon, just to check the lighting. The image popped onto the screen. It was a standard, mundane photo. The tent, the fire ring, the heavy duffel bags hanging from the tree. Yasser leaned back in his chair, taking a sip of his coffee. He reached for his mouse to close the program, but as his cursor moved across the screen, his eyes caught something. He stopped. He leaned closer to the monitor, his heart giving a sudden, violent lurch in his chest. In the deep background of the photo, far behind the tent, hidden deep within the shadows of the tree line, there was a blur. Yasser's hand trembled as he clicked the crop tool and zoomed in on the top right corner of the image. He enhanced the contrast. He sharpened the shadows. The coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. Duke woke up with a start, letting out a sharp bark. Hidden in the dense foliage, standing perfectly still, miles away from where Marcus Vance had been setting up his darkroom trap, was a figure. It wasn't Marcus. This figure was much taller, broader, wearing a pale, featureless hiking mask that covered their entire face. And in their hands, resting on a tripod hidden in the ferns, was a massive military-grade telephoto surveillance lens. The lens was pointed directly at Yasser. Marcus Vance had told the police he was an artist, creating exhibitions for wealthy anonymous buyers on the dark web. He claimed he worked alone. But as Yasser stared at the masked figure hidden in the background of his own photograph, a horrifying, paralyzing realization seized him. The artist had been captured, but the buyer was still watching.